The morning sun blazed mercilessly over the Afghan mountains as Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison studied the intelligence reports one final time. His six-man SEAL team had been tasked with what seemed like a routine reconnaissance mission deep in Taliban territory. The objective was simple: locate and identify a high-value target believed to be coordinating attacks against coalition forces from a remote compound nestled in the rocky terrain. Morrison's team consisted of seasoned operators, each man handpicked for this critical mission. There was Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez, the team's communications specialist whose steady hands had kept them connected during countless operations. Petty Officer Danny Walsh served as their explosives expert, a quiet man from Boston whose precision with demolitions was legendary among the teams. The medic Hospital Corpsman Second Class Kevin Park carried not just medical supplies but the weight of keeping his brothers alive when things went wrong. Rounding out the team were two riflemen, Petty Officer First Class Tony Ricci, whose Italian heritage showed in his passionate approach to everything, and Petty Officer Second Class Alex Chun, the youngest member whose eagerness sometimes worried Morrison. What Morrison didn't know was that their mission had been compromised before they even left base. A Taliban informant working within the Afghan National Army had passed along detailed information about the SEAL team's planned route, their equipment, and their timeline. The enemy was not just aware of their presence. They were ready for them. The team moved through the mountainous terrain with practiced silence, their boots finding purchase on the loose rock and sand. They had been walking for 3 hours when Rodriguez suddenly raised his fist, signaling the team to halt. Through his radio earpiece, he had detected unusual chatter on Taliban frequencies. The intercepted communications were fragmented, but the message was clear enough. The Americans are coming. Prepare the welcome. Morrison felt his stomach tighten as he processed this information. Their mission had potentially been blown, but they were already deep in enemy territory with no easy extraction point. The nearest landing zone for helicopter pickup was still 2 miles away, across open ground that would leave them completely exposed. Behind them, the route they had taken was now likely crawling with enemy fighters moving to cut off their retreat. The team pressed forward, but every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every rock formation a potential sniper's nest. Morrison made the difficult decision to continue toward their objective, hoping to complete the mission quickly and call for immediate extraction. It was a gamble that would soon prove nearly fatal. As they crested a ridge overlooking their target compound, Walsh spotted the first sign of trouble through his binoculars. The building that intelligence had described as lightly defended was surrounded by at least 30 Taliban fighters, many armed with heavy weapons including RPGs and machine guns. Worse still, the fighters were positioned in a classic ambush formation, clearly expecting the Americans' arrival. Morrison realized they had walked into a carefully orchestrated trap. The Taliban had turned their target into bait, using the compound as the centerpiece of an elaborate killing zone. The rocky terrain that had provided concealment during their approach now worked against them, offering limited escape routes and multiple elevated positions for enemy shooters. Before Morrison could order a withdrawal, the mountains erupted in gunfire. Muzzle flashes sparked from dozens of positions as Taliban fighters opened up with everything they had. Bullets whined off rocks and kicked up geysers of sand around the SEAL team as they scrambled for whatever cover they could find. Rodriguez's radio crackled with urgent calls for support, but the team's position made immediate helicopter extraction impossible. The Taliban had chosen their ambush site well. The narrow valley offered no suitable landing zones, and the surrounding peaks bristled with anti-aircraft weapons waiting for any rescue attempt. Chun cried out as a bullet tore through his shoulder, sending him sprawling behind a boulder. Park immediately moved to treat the wound, while return fire from the team's weapons echoed across the valley. But they were vastly outnumbered, and their ammunition wouldn't last long under such intense engagement. Morrison's mind raced through their options, none of them good. They could try to fight their way to higher ground, but that would mean crossing open terrain under heavy fire. They could attempt to hold their current position, but they lacked the ammunition and supplies for a prolonged siege. or they could try to retreat the way they came, likely running straight into the enemy forces that had undoubtedly moved to block their escape route. As bullets continued to rain down around them, Morrison realized his team was facing the very real possibility of being overrun. The Taliban fighters were already beginning to advance, using covering fire to move closer to the SEALs' position. In his earpiece, Rodriguez's voice carried a note of desperation as he continued calling for any available support, his transmission punctuated by the sharp crack of incoming rounds. The situation seemed hopeless, with death closing in from all sides. The elite SEAL team, trained for the most dangerous missions imaginable, found themselves trapped like animals in a carefully prepared killing ground. Unknown to them, however, salvation would soon come from the most unexpected source. A lone figure positioned high above the battle, watching through a powerful scope as the drama unfolded below. Staff Sergeant Michael "Ghost" Patterson had been alone on the mountain for 6 days, and he preferred it that way. 3 miles away from the unfolding battle, he occupied a carefully concealed position that offered commanding views of the entire valley system. His mission was supposed to be simple: provide overwatch and intelligence gathering for coalition forces operating in the region. What made his situation unusual was that he wasn't supposed to be there at all. Patterson had been officially relieved of duty 3 weeks earlier following what the military termed an incident of insubordination. The truth was more complicated. During a previous operation, Patterson had refused a direct order to take a shot that would have eliminated a high-value target, but also killed 2 civilian children playing nearby. His commanding officer saw it as a failure to follow orders. Patterson saw it as maintaining his humanity in an inhuman situation. The confrontation that followed had been heated and public, resulting in Patterson's removal from his unit and assignment to what was essentially military limbo, administrative duties at a forward operating base, while his case worked its way through the military justice system. But Patterson was not the kind of man who could sit behind a desk while his brothers in arms faced danger in the field. He had quietly gathered his gear and slipped away from the base, making his way to this remote position where he could still serve a purpose. His superiors would eventually discover his absence, and when they did, his military career would be over. But Patterson had made peace with that possibility. Some things mattered more than career advancement or staying out of trouble. Now, as he watched through his scope, Patterson saw the SEAL team taking devastating fire from multiple positions. His training kicked in automatically as he began calculating ranges, wind conditions, and target priorities. His weapon was a customized M24 sniper weapon system, a rifle he knew better than most men knew their own wives. Every adjustment screw, every scratch on the stock, every subtle characteristic of its behavior in different weather conditions was burned into his memory. Patterson had grown up hunting in the mountains of Montana, where his grandfather had taught him that patience and precision were more valuable than speed and aggression. Those lessons had served him well during 3 tours in Afghanistan, where he had earned a reputation as one of the most effective snipers in the entire theater of operations. His unofficial nickname, Ghost, came from his ability to remain unseen for weeks at a time, appearing only to deliver devastating long-range fire before vanishing back into the landscape. The irony of his current situation was not lost on him. The same moral code that had gotten him in trouble with his superiors was now driving him to risk everything to save fellow American soldiers. Patterson understood that by engaging the enemy, he would reveal his position and likely face court-martial when this was over. But watching good men die while he had the ability to help was not something he could live with. Through his scope, Patterson began identifying targets with methodical precision. He could see Taliban fighters maneuvering to flank the trapped SEAL team, their movements betraying their inexperience with fighting against professional soldiers. What the enemy fighters didn't realize was that their elevated positions, which gave them excellent fields of fire against the Americans below, also made them perfect targets for a sniper positioned even higher up the mountain. Patterson's first target was a Taliban machine gunner whose weapon was pouring devastating fire into the rocks where the SEALs had taken cover. The man was approximately 800 meters away, a challenging but manageable shot given the wind conditions and angle. Patterson controlled his breathing, feeling his heart rate slow as he entered the focused state that had made him so effective in the past. The crosshairs settled on the machine gunner's center mass. Patterson's finger took up the slack in the trigger, applying steady pressure until the rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the valley. Through his scope, he saw the Taliban fighter collapse backward, his weapon falling silent. Immediately, Patterson began searching for his next target, knowing that he had perhaps seconds before the enemy fighters realized they were being engaged from a new direction. His second shot took down an RPG gunner who was preparing to fire at the SEAL's position. The man dropped the weapon and tumbled down the rocky slope, disappearing from view. The effect on the battlefield was immediate and dramatic. The Taliban fighters, who had been confidently pressing their attack, suddenly found themselves under accurate long-range fire from an unknown position. Confusion spread through their ranks as commanders tried to identify the new threat while maintaining their assault on the trapped Americans. Patterson continued his deadly work with cold efficiency, picking off key targets and disrupting the enemy's coordinated attack. Each shot was carefully planned and precisely executed, his years of training and experience evident in the smooth cycle of target acquisition, range estimation, and trigger pull. He moved through his targets like a surgeon removing tumors, each round finding its mark with devastating effect. But Patterson knew this was only a temporary reprieve for the SEAL team. He was one man against dozens of enemy fighters, and eventually they would locate his position and bring overwhelming fire to bear against him. His ammunition was also limited. He had perhaps 40 rounds remaining, and each shot had to count. More critically, the Taliban fighters were beginning to adapt to this new threat. Instead of presenting themselves as easy targets, they were now moving more carefully, using cover and concealment to limit his opportunities for clean shots. The initial shock of his intervention was wearing off, and the enemy was regaining their composure. Through his radio, Patterson could hear the increasingly desperate communications from the SEAL team below. Chen's wound was worse than initially thought, and their ammunition was running dangerously low. If they were going to survive this engagement, Patterson would need to do more than just pick off individual targets. He would need to create an opportunity for their escape. As he studied the battlefield below, Patterson began formulating a plan that would require every bit of his skill and experience. It was dangerous and would almost certainly result in his position being compromised, but it might be the only way to save the lives of 6 American warriors who were running out of time and options. The Taliban commander crouched behind a large boulder, his radio crackling with confused reports from his scattered fighters. Mullah Qasim had spent months planning this ambush, carefully positioning his men to create an inescapable killing zone. The American Special Forces team had walked into his trap exactly as predicted, but now something had gone terribly wrong. "Brother, we are taking fire from the high ground," came the panicked voice of one of his squad leaders. "Ahmed and Rashid are down. We cannot see the shooter." Qasim raised his binoculars and scanned the mountain peaks above the valley. Somewhere up there, an American sniper was systematically dismantling his carefully orchestrated attack. With each shot, another of his fighters fell, and the survivors were becoming increasingly reluctant to expose themselves to return fire against the trapped SEAL team. Meanwhile, Patterson had identified the Taliban commander's position and was waiting for the right moment to take the shot that would decapitate the enemy's leadership. Through his scope, he could see the man's distinctive white turban as he moved between cover positions, trying to coordinate his fighters while staying hidden from the deadly fire coming from above. The distance was nearly 1,000 meters, at the very limit of Patterson's effective range. The wind was gusting unpredictably, and the angle was extreme, requiring him to compensate for the effects of gravity on the bullet's trajectory. It would be the most challenging shot of his career, but Patterson had been making impossible shots since he was 12 years old, hunting elk in the Montana wilderness with his grandfather's ancient rifle. Patterson settled into his shooting position, his breathing deep and controlled. Through his scope, he could see individual Taliban fighters hugging the ground, afraid to move as his previous shots had demonstrated the deadly reach of his weapon. The psychological effect was almost as important as the physical casualties. An enemy that is afraid to maneuver is an enemy that cannot effectively attack. His radio crackled with transmission from the SEAL team below. Morrison's voice was calm, but urgent. "Unknown sniper, this is SEAL Team 7. If you can hear this, we need immediate support for withdrawal to grid reference." The coordinates followed, identifying a rally point approximately 500 meters from their current position. Patterson keyed his radio briefly, breaking protocol, but knowing the situation demanded it. "SEAL Team 7, this is Overwatch. Roger your position. Stand by for covering fire during your movement." The response from Morrison was immediate. "Overwatch, confirm your friendly forces?" "Affirmative. American sniper providing support. Recommend you move in 2 minutes when I engage multiple targets simultaneously." Patterson had identified a cluster of Taliban fighters who were preparing to advance on the SEALs' position. They were positioned behind a series of rocks that provided excellent cover from below, but left them partially exposed to his elevated position. If he could eliminate or suppress this group, it would create a corridor for the SEAL team to begin their withdrawal. The plan required precision timing and perfect shot placement. Patterson would need to engage multiple targets in rapid succession, creating maximum confusion among the remaining enemy fighters while providing the SEALs with a window of opportunity to move. He selected his targets carefully. First, the machine gunner who was providing the heaviest fire, then an RPG operator who posed the greatest threat to the withdrawing Americans, followed by what appeared to be a section leader who was directing other fighters. 3 shots, 3 targets, maximum effect. Patterson's first round struck the machine gunner's center mass, the heavy bullet's impact spinning the man away from his weapon. Without pausing, he worked the bolt and acquired his second target. The RPG operator was reaching for his launcher when Patterson's bullet found him, sending the man tumbling down the rocky slope. The third target had seen his comrades fall and was already moving when Patterson's crosshairs found him. The shot was rushed, catching the Taliban fighter in the shoulder instead of center mass, but it was enough to remove him from the fight. "Moving now," came Morrison's voice over the radio, and Patterson could see the SEAL team beginning their tactical withdrawal, using fire and movement techniques to bound from cover to cover while Park helped the wounded Chun. The Taliban fighters, confused by the sudden and devastating fire from an unknown position, were slow to react to the Americans' movement. Those who did attempt to engage found themselves immediately targeted by Patterson's relentless fire. Every time an enemy fighter raised his head to aim, a precise shot from the mountain would force him back into cover or eliminate him entirely. But Patterson's intervention came at a cost. His muzzle flashes and the sound of his rifle were giving away his position, and he could see Taliban fighters beginning to move up the mountain toward him. More concerning, he spotted what appeared to be a mortar team setting up in a position that could range his hiding spot. The mathematics of the situation were becoming clear. Patterson could continue providing covering fire for the SEALs' withdrawal, but doing so would almost certainly result in his own death or capture. The logical choice would be to break contact and withdraw to a new position, preserving his own life while the SEAL team fought their way out as best they could. Instead, Patterson made the same choice he had made throughout his military career. He chose his brothers over himself. Keying his radio, he transmitted, "SEAL Team 7, continue movement to extraction point. I will maintain covering fire until you reach safety." "Negative, Overwatch." Morrison's voice came back immediately. "Do not compromise your position for our sake." "Too late for that," Patterson replied grimly, watching through his scope as more Taliban fighters moved up the mountain toward him. "Just get your people home." The mortar team below had completed their setup and was beginning to range his position. Patterson could see the crew making adjustments to their weapon as they prepared to drop high-explosive rounds on his concealed hide. He had perhaps minutes before the position became untenable. But the SEAL team was still exposed, still moving through dangerous ground where a single well-placed shot could end their escape. Patterson made his choice, settling behind his rifle for what might be his final shots of the war. If this was where his story ended, at least it would end with honor, protecting fellow warriors who deserved to see home again. The first mortar round impacted 50 meters above his position, showering his hide with rocks and debris. The Taliban gunners were walking their fire toward him, each round getting closer to his exact location. Patterson ignored the incoming fire and focused on his scope, searching for targets that threatened the withdrawing Americans below. The second mortar round landed just 30 meters from Patterson's position, close enough that the concussion left his ears ringing and dust clouding his scope. Through the haze, he could see Taliban fighters advancing up the mountain in bounds, using the mortar fire to cover their approach. They were perhaps 200 meters away now, close enough that he could make out individual faces through his optics. Below in the valley, the SEAL team was making good progress toward their extraction point, but they still had dangerous ground to cover. Chun was slowing them down despite Park's best efforts to keep him mobile, and their ammunition situation was becoming critical. Every few seconds, one of them would turn to lay down, covering fire while the others moved, but their shots were becoming more selective as they conserved their remaining rounds. Patterson had perhaps 15 rounds left in his rifle, plus 2 additional magazines in his pack. Against a conventional enemy force, that would be more than sufficient to break contact and withdraw. But the Taliban fighters climbing toward him showed no signs of breaking off their attack, even as his accurate fire continued to thin their ranks. His radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Morrison. "Overwatch, we have eyes on additional enemy forces moving to intercept our route. Looks like a squad-sized element taking position at the extraction point." Through his scope, Patterson could see what Morrison was referring to. A group of Taliban fighters had anticipated the Americans' escape route and were setting up an ambush at the very location where the SEAL team hoped to reach safety. It was a tactical masterstroke that would trap the Americans between 2 enemy forces, ensuring their destruction. Patterson studied the new threat through his optics, calculating ranges and angles. The enemy squad was approximately 1,200 meters away, a shot that pushed the absolute limits of his rifle's capability. With the wind conditions and extreme angle, hitting individual targets at that distance would require more luck than skill. But Patterson noticed something the Taliban fighters had missed in their haste to set up the ambush. They had chosen a position near a large boulder that had been fractured by weather and erosion. Years of hunting experience had taught Patterson to look for such opportunities. Sometimes you couldn't hit your target directly, but you could use the environment to your advantage. He aimed not at the enemy fighters, but at the weakest point in the fractured rock face above their position. His bullet struck the limestone with tremendous force, triggering a small rock slide that cascaded down onto the Taliban squad below. While not as devastating as a direct hit would have been, the falling stones forced the enemy fighters to abandon their position and seek cover, disrupting their planned ambush. "Extraction point is clear," Patterson transmitted. "Move fast before they reposition." But even as he helped clear the path for the SEALs' escape, Patterson's own situation was becoming desperate. The Taliban fighters climbing toward him had closed to within 100 meters, and their small arms fire was beginning to find his position. Bullets whined off the rocks around his hide, and he could hear voices calling to each other in Pashto as the enemy coordinated their final assault. A third mortar round impacted just 20 meters away, so close that the blast wave knocked Patterson's rifle off target and filled his position with choking dust. When the debris settled, he could see that his carefully constructed hide had been partially collapsed, leaving him more exposed to both enemy observation and incoming fire. Through his damaged position, Patterson could see individual Taliban fighters bounding up the mountain toward him. They moved with the confidence of men who knew their enemy was trapped and outnumbered. Some carried AK-47 rifles, while others wielded RPGs that could demolish his remaining cover with a single well-placed shot. Patterson made a quick inventory of his situation. His rifle was still functional despite the near miss from the mortar, but he had only 12 rounds remaining. His pistol carried 15 rounds, and He had 2 grenades that might slow down the advancing enemy. Against a dozen or more determined fighters, those weapons would not be sufficient for survival. But survival was no longer Patterson's primary concern. Through his scope, he could see the SEAL team approaching their extraction point, where a helicopter was beginning its approach for pickup. They were perhaps 5 minutes away from safety, but those 5 minutes felt like an eternity with Taliban fighters still in position to interfere with the extraction. One of the advancing enemy fighters raised an RPG launcher, aiming it at Patterson's position. At this range, the rocket-propelled grenade would be devastating, likely killing him instantly and eliminating any further threat to the Taliban forces. Patterson smoothly acquired the target and fired, his bullet striking the RPG operator's center mass just as the man's finger found the trigger. The grenade detonated prematurely as the dying fighter's hand spasmed, the explosion taking out 2 additional Taliban fighters and temporarily halting their advance. But Patterson knew it was only a reprieve. More fighters were moving up the mountain, and his ammunition was nearly exhausted. His radio crackled with Morrison's voice. "Overwatch, we are at the extraction point. Helicopter is inbound for pickup." "Roger that," Patterson replied, watching through his scope as the SEAL team reached the relative safety of the landing zone. "Glad you made it." There was a pause before Morrison's voice returned, heavy with emotion. "Unknown sniper. Identify yourself so we can coordinate your extraction." Patterson smiled grimly as he chambered another round and searched for his next target. "Negative on extraction. Just get your people home safe." "Say again, Overwatch. We are not leaving you behind." "That's an order, SEAL Team 7. Your mission is complete. Mine is just getting started." Patterson could see the helicopter approaching the landing zone, its rotors kicking up clouds of dust as it prepared to touch down. In moments, the SEAL team would be aboard and heading to safety, their successful extraction a testament to the brotherhood that bound all American warriors together. But that same brotherhood meant Patterson could never abandon his post while friendly forces remained in danger. Even as Taliban fighters closed in from multiple directions and his ammunition dwindled to single digits, he continued to scan for threats that might endanger the extraction. His war might end on this mountain, but it would end on his terms, protecting the men who had trusted him to watch their backs. The 4th mortar round landed just 10 meters away, and Patterson knew his time was almost up. The helicopter's engines roared as it lifted off from the landing zone, carrying the wounded SEAL team toward safety. Through the aircraft's windows, Morrison could see the mountain peak where their anonymous guardian continued his desperate fight against overwhelming odds. Despite the successful extraction, Morrison felt no sense of victory. Leaving a fellow warrior behind violated every principle he had learned in 15 years of military service. "Sir, we need to go back for him," Rodriguez shouted over the engine noise, echoing the thoughts of every man aboard the helicopter. Morrison was already on the radio with their command center, demanding immediate support for the lone sniper who had saved their lives. But the response was not what he wanted to hear. No additional aircraft were available in the immediate area, and the Taliban forces on the mountain made a rescue mission virtually impossible. Meanwhile, Patterson had fired his last rifle round, watching through his scope as another Taliban fighter fell to his precision shooting. The advancing enemy was now less than 50 meters away, close enough that he could hear their voices as they coordinated their final assault. His rifle was empty, but his pistol still held 15 rounds, enough to make his last stand count. As Patterson prepared to transition to his sidearm, something unexpected happened. The sound of rotor blades filled the air again, but this time from a different direction. Looking up, he saw 2 Apache attack helicopters approaching fast, and, lo, their pilots having received Morrison's urgent calls for support. "Unknown sniper, this is Apache 17, came a voice over Patterson's radio. "We are inbound to your position. Mark your location with smoke if you have it." Patterson pulled the pin on his one remaining smoke grenade and tossed it away from his position, creating a green cloud that would help the helicopter crews distinguish him from the enemy fighters. The Apaches immediately began engaging the Taliban positions with devastating accuracy, their chain guns and rockets turning the mountain slope into a killing field. Under cover of the aerial assault, Patterson began his own withdrawal from the collapsed height. The Taliban fighters who had been so close to overrunning his position were now scattered and seeking cover from the Apaches' overwhelming firepower. It was the first time in hours that Patterson could move without immediately drawing accurate enemy fire. But the battle was far from over. Even as the Apache helicopters dominated the immediate area around Patterson's position, Taliban reinforcements were moving up the mountain from multiple directions. The enemy commander had committed significant resources to this engagement, and he was not willing to let it end without inflicting casualties on the Americans. Patterson's radio crackled with a new voice. Morrison calling from the rescue helicopter that was now returning to the area despite the ongoing danger. Overwatch, we have a bird inbound for your extraction. Can you reach the landing zone at grid reference? The coordinates Morrison provided were for a small clearing approximately 400 meters down the mountain, a dangerous distance to cover while under fire, but Patterson's only chance for survival. As he began his movement toward the extraction point, the Apache helicopters continued their devastating attacks on Taliban positions, buying him precious time. The descent down the mountainside was harrowing. Every boulder could hide an enemy fighter, every ridge line a potential ambush site. Patterson moved with the practiced stealth that had earned him his nickname, using terrain features and the chaos of the ongoing airstrikes to mask his movement. Halfway to the extraction point, Patterson encountered a Taliban fighter who had been separated from his unit during the Apache attack. The man appeared around a rock formation just 10 meters away, his AK-47 already rising toward Patterson's position. There was no time for careful aim. Patterson drew his pistol and fired 3 rapid shots, dropping the enemy fighter before he could get off a single round. The gunshots drew attention from other Taliban survivors in the area, and Patterson soon found himself under fire from multiple directions as he continued his fighting withdrawal toward the landing zone. His pistol answered each threat with precise shots, his years of training evident in the smooth economy of his movements. As Patterson reached the designated extraction point, he could see the rescue helicopter approaching through the smoke and dust of the ongoing battle. It was the same aircraft that had extracted the SEAL team earlier, but now Morrison and his men were aboard as part of the rescue force, their own weapons adding to the suppressing fire that kept Taliban fighters away from the landing zone. The helicopter touched down just long enough for Patterson to dive through the open door before lifting off immediately, its crew chief returning fire at Taliban positions even as they climbed towards safety. As the aircraft gained altitude and distance from the mountain, Patterson finally allowed himself to believe that he might survive this engagement. "Good to see you, Ghost," Morrison said, using the nickname he had learned from radio chatter with Patterson's former unit. "We owe you everything." Patterson nodded, but said nothing, his attention focused on the battlefield below as it receded into the distance. The cost of the day's engagement was still being calculated. Taliban casualties were significant, but several American aircraft had been damaged, and ammunition expenditures were massive. More importantly, Patterson knew his military career was effectively over. Going absent without leave and engaging in unauthorized combat operations would result in court-martial proceedings that could end in prison time. But as he looked around the helicopter at the faces of the 6 SEAL team members he had helped save, Patterson felt no regret about his choices. These men would return to their families, would continue to serve their country, would live to fight another day because he had been willing to risk everything to protect them. 3 weeks later, Patterson stood at attention in a military courtroom as the charges against him were read aloud. Absent without leave, disobeying direct orders, engaging in unauthorized combat operations. The list was extensive and the potential penalties severe. But as the proceedings began, something unexpected happened. Morrison and his entire SEAL team entered the courtroom, along with the Apache pilots who had provided air support and dozens of other military personnel who had heard about Patterson's actions. One by one, They testified about the lone sniper who had risked everything to save fellow Americans, whose precision fire had turned certain defeat into miraculous victory. The military judge, a decorated veteran himself, listened carefully to the testimony before rendering his verdict. While Patterson was found guilty of the technical charges against him, he was sentenced only to time already served and reduction in rank. More importantly, his actions on that Afghan mountain were officially recognized with the award of the Silver Star for gallantry in action. Patterson left the military shortly afterward, but he never left behind the brotherhood that had defined his service. The bonds forged in combat transcended military rank, unit affiliation, and even the boundaries between different branches of the armed forces. On a mountain in Afghanistan, an outcast sniper had proven that true warriors never abandon their brothers, no matter the personal cost. Years later, when veterans gathered to share their stories, they would speak of the ghost on the mountain who appeared when death seemed certain and disappeared when honor had been satisfied. For those who were there, Patterson's legend needed no embellishment. The simple truth of what he had done was heroic enough.